This is Audible.
Strengthened by Fire, from the By Fire series. Written by Andrew Gray. Narrated by Peter B. Brook for Falcon Sound Company. Chapter 1. Lee Stockton sat in the station living area watching television during the evening shift. He just returned from a call, and he could hear the captain in his office working on the call report. The station was unusually quiet. If the television weren't on, the place would feel closer to a morgue than a fire station. "Find something to do," the captain called from his office, and then Lee heard heavy footsteps on the floor. "Go check on the drying hoses," he barked a little harshly, pointing at one of the men. "The showers need to be cleaned," he said, pointing at another of the guys. Lee jumped off the sofa and headed downstairs to the engine garage. He certainly was going to keep himself busy so he didn't get one of the shit jobs. Finding a soft rag, he got to work polishing the brass and chrome on the pumper they'd bought recently. The yellow engine was the first piece of new equipment the company had been able to purchase in almost 5 years, and they'd been raising money for most of that time. Lee looked around the garage and reminded himself that he'd meant to ask if there were funds in the maintenance budget for paint and supplies. The inside of the garage could use a fresh coat of paint, as could the entire building for that matter. Actually, what the building needed was a renovation. The showers and bathrooms were old and really showing the wear, and the kitchen needed updating. Not that any of it was Lee's responsibility exactly, but he had eyes and he could see it, the same as anyone else. The captain had told him that once they got the pumper they needed, the plan was to raise funds to redo the building. Others worked around him, doing the same thing Lee was, keeping busy and staying out of the captain's way. No one talked like they usually did. Instead, the same tension and quiet seemed to hang over the entire building. Greg Martin, who was working on one of the older engines, dropped a wrench, and the clang resounded through the building like nails on a chalkboard. Lee could feel the tension that had crackled around all of them for hours begin to sizzle. There wasn't a person in the station who wasn't balancing on a knife edge, and when the alarm rang, Lee practically jumped out of his skin before leaping into his gear and getting on the truck. The others rushed around with trained efficiency, and in a matter of seconds, they were ready to leave. Never in his life had he been so grateful for an emergency call. The vehicle began to move, and the siren sounded as they pulled out of the firehouse and turned onto Hanover Street. Lee's heart pounded like it always did, and his mind shifted from worry to what he was trained to do. The tension that had been building for most of the evening receded, and he focused on the job ahead of him. By the time they arrived at the house with smoke billowing from the windows, Lee was in his normal work frame of mind and ready. The fire engine had barely pulled to a stop, and the men were jumping to the ground, pulling out hoses and getting equipment ready. "There's still a boy in the house," the captain told Lee as he pulled on his breathing equipment. "First floor toward the back of the house, according to the mother." Lee nodded and walked through the spray of water already being poured on the house. He often got assignments like this, both because he was level-headed in these situations and because of his size. Lee was massive and strong as hell. A few weeks ago, he'd been in a burning building and part of a wall had fallen, trapping a man under it. Lee had simply lifted the wall, shoving it away, and carried the man to safety. Entering the front door of the small house, Lee was surrounded by swirling smoke and very little light. The smoke seemed to be heaviest in the area of the house that appeared to be the kitchen, and he heard crackling and sputtering from that direction, but he didn't stop, continuing down the hall of the typical ranch-style house, pushing open each bedroom door and peering inside. They all appeared empty, and the smoke was definitely getting thicker. Lee could also hear fire building in the kitchen. Through his radio, he called his position to the crew and told them what he thought was happening. "We're on the kitchen," he heard in response. "Find the kid." "Roger, on it," Lee said as he approached the final door. It seemed to be locked, and Lee backed up before using his weight to break it in. The door flew open, and a kid who looked to be about 12 and who wore nothing but underwear jumped up out of the bed, screaming at the top of his lungs. The room appeared momentarily clear of smoke, but it billowed in through the open door, so Lee slammed it shut behind him. Lee rushed to the bedroom window and threw it open. I'm sending the kid out the back bedroom window. Have someone there! Lee called through the radio, and he heard an affirmative response. A loud whoosh sounded from behind him, and Lee immediately felt heat through his fire suit. Fire had erupted somewhere in the house, and the door to the bedroom blew open. Grabbing a blanket off the bed, Lee wrapped the kid in it and threaded him out the window. He felt someone take hold, and then the kid was passed out of his hands. Lee grabbed a chair from the corner and used it as a club to break out the rest of the window. Making sure the opening was free of glass, Lee climbed sideways through it and felt the guys helping him out and onto the ground. "Get the hell away!" came through the radio in his headgear, and Lee grabbed the kid, lifting him off his feet as they ran a safe distance away. Then the house exploded in a fireball that knocked them all to the ground. "What the fuck was that?" Lee asked out loud as he turned back toward the house, trying to stop his heart from leaping into his throat. A few more seconds, and he would have been toast. "We're okay back here," Lee said, looking around at the other firefighters and the kid, who were all slowly getting to their feet. Catching his breath, Lee pulled off his breathing equipment and lifted the barefooted kid into his arms before walking around the neighboring house to the street where numerous fire, police, and ambulance vehicles now sat with their lights flashing. "Juan!" A woman ran to where Lee was carrying the boy, tears running down her face, two small children in tow. Lee set the boy down, and he was immediately engulfed in what Lee assumed were his mother's arms. She cried and began speaking rapidly in Spanish. Lee understood every sentiment because her relief and the expression in her eyes when she looked at him told Lee all he needed to know. "What happened, Cap?" Lee asked once he'd stepped away. One of the guys handed him a bottle of water, and he gratefully took it. The last portions of the house standing collapsed in a hiss of smoke and steam as the flames died down. "They were storing gasoline in cans in the basement. If I'd known, I would never have sent you inside like that." The usual lines on the captain's forehead deepened. "We didn't find out until we were able to get someone in here to translate." "There must have been quite a bit, judging by the size of that fireball." Lee gulped from the bottle, watching as more water was poured onto the pile of wreckage that had been a house. A man rushed across the front yard and joined the family, the five of them all looking at what had once been the center of their lives. Lee sat down, his heart still racing as he finished his water. Then he threw the bottle in a trash can and helped the guys police the area and make sure the fire was completely out. The laborious task of cleaning up and moving out equipment began. The entire time, Lee didn't allow himself to think about what could have happened if he'd been a little later getting out of that house. 60 seconds had meant the difference between life and death. It took a while, but they eventually certified that the fire was out. The ambulances left, empty, thank God, and some of the fire trucks loaded up and headed back to their stations. The Red Cross arrived to help the family, and eventually Lee and his fellow firefighters headed back to the station house. When they arrived, Lee took care of his equipment, checking it over carefully before cleaning it and getting it ready for the next call. Once that was taken care of, he headed upstairs and into the showers. He heard other men doing the same thing, but just like before the call, no one was speaking, laughing, or recalling the fire the way they usually did. They'd had their respite, but the tension was back almost instantly, just like they'd never left. The water felt good, but Lee didn't linger, mechanically washing himself before rinsing and drying off. Then he dressed, walked back out to the living area, and sat on the sofa. "Stockton, you did real good," Cap told him with a pat on the shoulder as he walked past and into the kitchen. Other men wandered in, all sitting around looking at each other, and then at Cap, each asking the same question. How could that happen? "I don't know," Cap said with a shrug before heading to his office. Lee knew he'd have one hell of a report to write up after that fire. Footsteps reverberated like a herd of elephants on the stairs, and everyone looked up at the same time as some of the men from the other shifts wandered in, taking chairs, each of them hanging their heads. Lee watched for Dirk Krause, his boyfriend, who was the last one up the stairs. Lee knew exactly how the borough council meeting had gone by the anger and resentment that shone in his lover's eyes. "Okay," Cap said as he joined them. "Let's get this over with so we can get some work done."
Council decided to reduce the number of fire stations in town from 3 to 2,
Dirk said from between gritted teeth.
All they talked about was the potential for saving money that some consultant came up with.
Dirk was fuming, and for once the man's temper seemed to come in handy because the others all echoed it.
It looks as though the one to close will either be Goodwill or us.
Lee glanced at the others, who all nodded their agreement with Dirk's assessment. "Did they make a decision?" Lee asked. "No," Carter, one of the other captains, answered. "They seem to go back and forth between one and then the other. I think we have 2 or 3 council members on the side of keeping us open, and there are an equal number in favor of keeping Goodwill open. I think the only reason they didn't decide to close us tonight is because we're the oldest fire company in town, and there are enough historic preservationists on council and in town that we got a reprieve, but I don't know if that'll save us in the end or not. They kept saying that they weren't talking about cutting personnel, and that all firefighters would have a job at one of the 2 remaining companies." Lee knew Carter was trying to put the best face on it he could. "They did agree to decide in 3 months because of other issues that are before the board, so we can expect visits from council members." A groan came up from everyone in the crowd. "Is it okay to accidentally spray them with water?" one of the guys asked, and some of the others chuckled as Captain Carter rolled his eyes. "Not if you want to keep this place open," he answered with a bit of a smile. "We also need to figure out how much we have in the maintenance budget, because among the things cited were the age of the building and the need for renovations." Lee watched Carter look around, and they all did the same. It was funny how he seemed to see things he'd never noticed before. The old carpeting, the scratches in the walls, places where hundreds of hands had turned the areas around the light fixtures oily and dark, the furniture that was dated and rough from heavy use. Lee sighed softly, tired and a bit defeated. He moved over when Dirk sat next to him, and though he wanted to lean against him for a bit of comfort, he couldn't do that here. The guys knew they were a couple. That had been made plain last fall when Dirk had rescued him from the flooded spring run and kissed him in front of half the company. However, both of them had been circumspect about their behavior at work, conscientiously keeping their behavior professional.